Everyone hated this black dog for barking all day, until they found out why. But in the quiet town of Millbrook, North Carolina, nobody was prepared for what this misunderstood animal was really trying to tell them. Shadow wasn't always alone. 6 years ago, he'd been just a puppy when the Hendricks family brought him home to their small house on Maple Street. Back then, his coat was glossy black, his eyes bright with hope, and his tail never stopped wagging. The children loved him. Mrs. Hendricks would scratch behind his ears every morning before work. But families change. People move on. When the Hendricks relocated to Charlotte for work, they made a decision that would haunt Shadow for years to come. They couldn't take him with them, they said. Too much hassle. Too expensive. So they left him with a distant relative who lived on the outskirts of town, an older woman named Betty who already had 3 cats and barely enough money to feed herself. Betty did her best, but Shadow was too much for her. He was young, energetic, confused about why his family had disappeared. Within 6 months, Betty couldn't handle him anymore. She put him outside and told herself it was temporary. That temporary arrangement stretched into years. Shadow learned to survive on his own. He found shelter under Betty's back porch, scrounged for food wherever he could find it, and slowly watched the world around him change. The bright, hopeful puppy became a wary, desperate dog. His black coat grew dull and matted. His ribs began to show. And that's when the barking started. At first, it was just occasional. A bark when someone walked by. A howl when he was lonely. But as Shadow grew hungrier, more isolated, more desperate for human connection, the barking became constant. It echoed through the quiet streets of Millbrook from dawn until well past midnight. The neighbors had had enough. Millbrook was the kind of town where people knew each other's names, where children rode their bikes until sunset, where the biggest news was usually about the high school football team or the annual harvest festival. It was peaceful. Quiet. The kind of place people moved to escape the chaos of city life. Shadow's barking shattered that peace. "I haven't slept through the night in months," complained Sarah Mitchell, who lived 3 houses down from Betty's place. She stood in Miller's hardware store on a Tuesday morning, dark circles under her eyes, telling anyone who would listen about the nuisance dog. "Something's got to be done," agreed Tom Peterson, the store owner. "My wife's on night shift at the hospital. She can't get proper rest during the day with all that racket." The complaints poured in. Phone calls to Betty's house went unanswered. She'd grown deaf in her old age and couldn't hear the dog anymore. Calls to animal control led nowhere. Millbrook was too small to have its own department, and the county service was overwhelmed and understaffed. Shadow had become the town pariah. Children crossed the street when they saw him wandering through the neighborhood, searching for scraps. Adults muttered under their breath when his howling interrupted their evening television programs. Even the mailman, usually friendly to every dog in town, hurried past Betty's house without slowing down. "That dog's gone feral," said Mayor Linda Roberts during a town meeting that fall. She was a stern woman in her 50s, practical and no-nonsense. "If something doesn't change soon, we'll have to take more serious measures." Everyone knew what that meant. 17-year-old Ellie Cooper particularly despised Shadow. Her bedroom window faced Betty's backyard, and every morning at 5:30, his barking jolted her awake. She tried everything: earplugs, white noise machines, even sleeping in the living room. Nothing worked. "I wish someone would just get rid of that stupid dog," she complained to her friends at school. "He's ruining my senior year. I can barely stay awake in class." But there was one person in Millbrook who didn't join the chorus of complaints. Harold Jenkins, a 68-year-old widower who lived 4 blocks away from Betty's house, often found himself listening to Shadow's barking with something approaching sympathy. Harold knew about being alone. He'd lost his wife Martha 3 years ago to cancer. Before that, he'd spent 25 years as a firefighter, then another 15 years as a volunteer EMT. He'd seen enough suffering in his lifetime to recognize it in others, even when others came in the form of a desperate black dog. Harold had fought in Vietnam as a young man, then come home to build a quiet life in Millbrook. He'd raised 2 children who now lived states away, buried the love of his life, and spent his retirement tending a small garden and reading mystery novels. He understood loneliness. He understood what it meant to cry out and have no one listen. So when Shadow's barking echoed through the November air, Harold didn't curse or complain. Instead, he'd sit on his front porch and listen, wondering what the dog was trying to say. "You hear something we don't you, boy?" Harold would murmur to himself, though he never ventured close enough for Shadow to hear him. The dog had grown skittish around humans after years of rejection. The other residents of Millbrook didn't share Harold's patience. As winter approached, the complaints grew louder and more frequent. Someone spray-painted, "Shut up," on the side of Betty's fence. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes, suggesting solutions for the dog problem. The tension in the small town was building like pressure in a kettle. Nobody realized that Shadow's desperate barking was about to save them all. The first week of December brought unusually heavy rains to North Carolina. What started as a typical winter storm system stalled over the mountains west of Millbrook, dumping inches of water day after day. The creeks that normally trickled peacefully through the town began to swell. The ground became saturated, and Shadow's barking grew more frantic than ever. It was December 8th when Harold first noticed something different about the dog's behavior. He'd been sitting in his kitchen, eating a quiet dinner and listening to the rain pound against his windows, when Shadow's howling took on a new urgency. It wasn't the usual lonely wailing. This was sharp, insistent, almost like an alarm. Harold set down his fork and listened more carefully. The barking was coming in rapid bursts, then stopping, then starting again. It had a pattern to it. A rhythm. Like the dog was trying to communicate something specific. "What's got you so worked up tonight?" Harold wondered aloud. The barking continued for hours. Even after Harold went to bed, he could hear Shadow's voice cutting through the sound of rain and wind. By 2 in the morning, Harold gave up trying to sleep. He made a pot of coffee and sat by his kitchen window, watching the storm and listening to the dog's persistent calls. That's when he noticed the water. At first, it was just a thin trickle seeping through the basement wall where it met the foundation. Harold had seen it before during heavy rains, just a minor leak that dried up when the weather cleared. But tonight something was different. The water was coming through faster, and it wasn't clear. It was muddy, debris-filled, carrying the smell of earth and decay. Harold grabbed a flashlight and headed down to his basement. What he found made his blood run cold. Water was seeping through multiple cracks in the foundation wall. The basement floor was already covered in 2 inches of murky liquid. And outside, beyond the wall, Harold could hear something that made his years of emergency experience kick into high gear. A low, rumbling sound. Like thunder, but constant. Like something massive was moving through the earth itself. Harold knew that sound. He'd heard it twice before in his firefighting career, both times during natural disasters that had cost lives. It was the sound of water finding its way through soil and rock, carrying everything in its path, building pressure until something gave way. The hillside behind Millbrook was saturated. Unstable. And if Harold's decades of emergency experience were right, they had maybe 30 minutes before it all came down. He rushed upstairs and grabbed his phone, dialing the emergency services dispatch. But the lines were jammed. Storms across the region had knocked out power and overwhelmed the system. He tried again. Busy signal. Again. Nothing. Shadow's barking grew even more intense, as if the dog could sense Harold's growing panic. Harold threw on his raincoat and boots. If he couldn't reach emergency services, he'd have to warn people himself. He started with his closest neighbors, pounding on doors, shouting over the storm. "You need to evacuate! Now! Get to higher ground! "Harold, have you lost your mind?" demanded Pete Williams, opening his door in a bathrobe. "It's 3 in the morning." "Listen to me," Harold said urgently. "I've seen this before. The hillside's unstable. We've got maybe 20 minutes before it gives way." Pete started to argue, but something in Harold's voice, the authority of a man who'd spent decades dealing with emergencies, made him pause. And in that pause they both heard it. The rumbling sound was getting louder. Shadow's barking had reached a fever pitch. "Get your family and get out," Harold said. "I'm warning the others." Harold ran from house to house, his old legs carrying him faster than they had in years. Some people listened. Others slammed doors in his face, thinking the old man had finally lost his mind. But enough believed him to create a chain reaction. Neighbors warned neighbors. Phone calls were made to relatives. Cars began backing out of driveways. Mayor Linda Roberts received a call from her deputy clerk, who'd been awakened by Harold's warnings. "Linda, I know this sounds crazy, but Harold Jenkins is going door to door saying we need to evacuate. Something about the hillside." Linda looked out her bedroom window at the rain-soaked night. "Harold's been alone too long. He's probably just spooked by the storm." "Maybe," the deputy said. "But Mrs. Patterson called me too. She said her basement's flooding worse than she's ever seen. And that dog has been barking like he's on fire." Linda hesitated. She'd known Harold for 20 years. He wasn't the type to panic over nothing. And if there was even a chance, he was right. "Start making calls," she told her deputy. "Everyone in the lower valley. Tell them it's a precautionary evacuation." At 3:47 a.m. on December 8th, the Millbrook hillside gave way. Harold was helping elderly Mrs. Chin into her grandson's car when they heard it, a sound like the world itself was breaking apart. The rumble became a roar. Trees cracked like gunshots. And then, in the glow of emergency flares and headlights, they saw it coming. A wall of mud, rock, and debris 20 feet high, moving through the darkness like a living thing. It swept away Betty's house first, the little structure disappearing in seconds. Then the Hendricks old place, where Shadow had once been loved. Then 3 more houses, 2 trailers, and the small bridge that connected the lower valley to the main part of town. The flood waters followed, rushing down from the saturated hills, turning streets into rivers, carrying away everything in their path. Cars, trees, pieces of houses, all swept along in the churning, muddy torrent. But the people were safe. 63 residents of Lower Millbrook had evacuated in time, warned by an old firefighter who'd listened to what everyone else ignored. They'd all been saved by the barking of a lonely black dog. As dawn broke over the devastated town, survivors gathered at the elementary school that had been turned into an emergency shelter. The Red Cross was setting up cots. The National Guard was coordinating rescue efforts. News crews were arriving from Charlotte and Raleigh. And in the midst of the chaos, Harold Jenkins sat on a folding chair, holding a shivering black dog in his lap. Shadow had nearly drowned in the flood. Harold found him clinging to debris, exhausted and terrified, no longer barking. The dog's makeshift shelter under Betty's porch was gone. The old woman who'd fed him scraps was gone too. She'd died in her sleep 2 days earlier, though nobody had discovered her body before the flood took her house away. Shadow was truly alone now. But for the first time in years, he wasn't unwanted. "Is that the dog that saved everyone?" asked Ellie Cooper, approaching Harold's chair. Her family had been among those evacuated, their house now sitting in 6 feet of mud and flood water. Harold nodded, gently stroking Shadow's damp fur. "He tried to warn us for hours. I was the only one listening." Ellie knelt down beside them. The anger she'd carried toward Shadow for months was gone, replaced by something she hadn't expected to feel. Gratitude. And shame. "I hated him," she said quietly. "I wanted him gone. He was just trying to survive," Harold replied. Sometimes desperate souls make noise because it's the only way they know to ask for help. Mayor Linda Roberts approached them, her usually stern expression softer than anyone had seen it in years. "Harold, the news crews want to interview you. You're a hero." Harold shook his head. "I'm not the hero here." He scratched behind Shadow's ears, and for the first time in months, the dog's tail wagged. "He is." The story of Shadow and the Millbrook flood made national news. Video footage of the devastation was broadcast across the country, followed by the remarkable story of how one man's willingness to listen to a barking dog had saved an entire community. But more than the news coverage, more than the disaster relief efforts, more than the plans to rebuild the town on higher ground, what touched people's hearts was the image of Harold Jenkins adopting the black dog that nobody had wanted. "I should have listened sooner," Harold told a reporter from the Charlotte Observer. "All those months, he was trying to tell us something. We just thought he was being a nuisance." Within days, donations poured in from across the country. Not just for flood relief, but specifically for Shadow. Dog food, toys, a new bed, veterinary care. Letters from children who'd heard his story. Adoption offers from families who wanted to give him a home. But Harold had already made his decision. "He's been through enough changes," the old firefighter said. "He's got a home now. A permanent one." 3 months later, Millbrook held its first post-flood town meeting in the rebuilt community center. The town looked different now, houses constructed on higher ground, a new early warning system installed, emergency protocols updated based on lessons learned from that terrible December night. Shadow lay quietly beside Harold's chair during the meeting, wearing a collar that read, "Hero," a gift from the local animal shelter. He no longer barked constantly. He no longer searched desperately for food or affection. He'd found what he'd been looking for all along. Mayor Roberts addressed the crowd as the meeting came to a close. "We've learned a lot about ourselves these past few months," she said. "About how we respond to crisis, how we rebuild, how we take care of each other. But maybe the most important lesson came from the most unexpected source." She looked down at Shadow, sleeping peacefully in the warmth of the community center. "We almost lost 63 of our neighbors because we weren't listening. We heard noise and assumed it was meaningless. We saw a desperate animal and decided he was a nuisance instead of someone in need." She paused, her voice growing softer. "Shadow didn't save us just on that night in December. He taught us something about what it means to be a community. About paying attention to the voices we'd rather ignore. About recognizing that sometimes the ones who seem the most troublesome are actually trying to help us." Harold reached down and patted Shadow's head. The dog opened one eye, looked up at him with trust and contentment, then settled back into sleep. After the meeting, Ellie Cooper approached Harold as he was preparing to leave. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, "I wanted to thank you again. For listening. For warning us. For saving my family." Harold nodded. "Just doing what needed to be done." "No," Ellie said. "You did more than that. You showed us how to be better neighbors. How to pay attention to each other." She knelt down and gently petted Shadow. "I'm sorry I hated you," she whispered to the dog. "I'm sorry nobody listened." Shadow's tail wagged softly against the floor. As Harold and Shadow walked home through the quiet streets of the rebuilt Millbrook, the old firefighter reflected on how much had changed. The town was different now, closer, more aware, more willing to help each other. People checked on their elderly neighbors more often. They paid attention to signs of trouble. They listened. And Shadow was different too. No longer the desperate, barking dog that everyone wanted to disappear, he'd become a beloved member of the community. Children stopped to pet him during his daily walks with Harold. Shopkeepers saved special treats for him. The veterinarian provided his care for free. Most importantly, he no longer needed to bark for attention. He had a home. He had love. He had a purpose. "You know what, boy?" Harold said as they reached their front porch. I think we saved each other. Shadow looked up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had tried so hard to warn them all. Then he settled down beside Harold's chair, content and quiet, no longer alone. The autumn sun was setting over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the rebuilt town. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, not in desperation, but in simple greeting. And this time, everyone listened. Sometimes, the ones we ignore the most end up saving us all. Shadow had taught them that. He'd taught them that every voice matters, that every creature deserves compassion, and that listening, really listening, to those who seem different or difficult might be the most important thing we can do for each other. In the end, the black dog who'd been hated for his constant barking became the reason an entire community learned how to love a little better, listen a little closer, and remember that we're all just trying to find our way home. And sometimes, home finds us when we least expect it, in the form of a faithful friend who never stops trying to keep us safe.